Okay, so I want you to just imagine this scene for a second. Try to put yourself right there in the room. It is 1920.
Right.
You are standing in Madison Square Garden, and there are 25,000 people just absolutely roaring. You can practically feel the heat, the sheer electricity in the air.
Yeah, the atmosphere would have been unbelievable.
Completely off the charts. And standing up there is this man, and he's draped in these regal, incredibly striking military-style vestments. Crimson, black, green. And the crowd is just in a total frenzy as he is officially declared the Provisional President of Africa.
Provisional President of an entire continent.
Exactly. And he's got a fully staffed cabinet. He has an African Legion with these strict, immaculate military uniforms. I mean, he is actively building the largest black mass movement in modern history.
It really is.
But, and here is the massive contradiction that we just have to unpack today. This man, the Provisional President of this vast continent, never stepped foot on African soil. Not a single time.
Wait, never?
Never. And, understanding how Marcus Garvey orchestrated that massive contradiction, it isn't just some dusty history lesson. It is an absolute masterclass in the messy, frequently dangerous psychology of charismatic leadership.
It really is a staggering paradox.
It is. We are looking at a man who claimed millions of devoted followers, right? He built this empire on the absolute necessity of black pride and self-reliance, but then at the absolute height of his power, he willingly sat down at a negotiating table in Atlanta with the leader of the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah, that is the moment that always stops people in their tracks. It forces us to really confront how political and social empires are constructed.
Yeah.
They're built on raw emotion, on shared trauma, and this desperate need for collective identity.
So true. And for today's deep dive, we're pulling entirely from a really comprehensive biographical source on Garvey. Our mission here is to trace this incredible, wildly complex trajectory.
Right, because we have to unpack his whole meteoric rise. I mean, going from a young print worker in colonial Jamaica to an absolute titan in Harlem. We'll get into his crushing financial and legal failures and, of course, dissect that deeply complex, almost mythological legacy he left behind.
Yeah, and for those of you listening right now, whether you closely follow modern political movements or you're just fascinated by the psychology of visionary leaders, or maybe you just want to understand the very roots of global Pan-Africanism, the blueprint starts right here.
It really does.
And to understand the sheer audacity of his later ambitions, his intense, almost obsessive focus on race and class, we can't start in Harlem. We have to start at his beginnings in the incredibly rigid social hierarchy of colonial Jamaica.
Right.
He was born in 1887 in St. Ann's Bay, and the societal rules he was born into were just suffocating.
Yeah, they were. To really grasp his worldview, you've got to understand the specific mechanics of colonial Jamaican society at that time.
Yeah.
It didn't operate on a simple binary of black and white like we might picture.
Okay, so how did it work?
Well, it functioned on a very strict colorist social hierarchy. So because Marcus Garvey was a black child of full African descent in his physical appearance, the system automatically placed him at the absolute lowest end of the social ladder.
Wow, just by default.
Exactly. The colonial structure heavily favored those with lighter skin or mixed heritage. They were elevated into this administrative middle class, while the white British colonial elite just sat comfortably at the very top, controlling the economy, the government, everything.
Right.
So Garvey's pure African ancestry was, in the eyes of his society, just an insurmountable barrier to upward mobility.
Which actually makes his family dynamic so fascinating to me, because it seems like his father completely rejected that societal limitation, at least on an intellectual level.
He did, yeah.
His father, Malchus, was a stonemason, but he wasn't just a manual laborer. The source material points out he was entirely self-educated and actually maintained a personal library.
A personal library for a stonemason in that era was a big deal.
Huge deal. But Malchus was also this deeply paradoxical figure. He served as a deacon at a local church, but the sources describe him as an incredibly intolerant and punitive father.
Right, very harsh.
Very harsh, and financially reckless, too. He eventually lost most of the land he owned over his lifetime. And when you look at that, you can really see how Marcus inherited that fierce, uncompromising intellect. But unfortunately, maybe some of that profound financial recklessness, too.
Absolutely.
And they just never had a close, loving relationship.
Yeah, and that father-son alienation, it's a pattern you see repeatedly in the biographies of hyper-driven historical figures.
Right, that emotional void.
Exactly. That emotional void often fuels a relentless external ambition. Now, his mother, Sarah Richards, provided a pretty stark contrast. She was a domestic servant, and she was known for her gentle demeanor.
So economically, where did that leave them?
Well, socially, the family was considered petite bourgeoisie. To break that down for you listening, it means they weren't destitute peasant farmers. They had a trade, they had a tiny bit of property, but they were still entirely excluded from the true middle class.
So they were basically always on the edge.
Yeah, facing severe, constant economic precarity. Marcus was actually able to attend a local church school up to age 14, but further formal education was simply out of the question financially.
He had to go to work.
Right. He started working on his uncle's tenant farm and eventually apprenticed as a printer with his godfather.
And there's this really poignant detail from his childhood that jumped out at me from the source. He later recalled having this close childhood friend, and she was a white girl, the daughter of a local minister.
Oh, yeah, this is a pivotal story.
He actually wrote about it later. He said, "We were two innocent fools who never dreamed of a race feeling and problem. But," and this is just heartbreaking, "as they hit their teenage years, her parents sent her away to school, and she was explicitly instructed to completely distance herself from him." I mean, try to put yourself in the shoes of a 14-year-old kid experiencing that. It's this jarring, visceral realization that the world has built these invisible, impenetrable walls around you based entirely on the amount of melanin in your skin.
It was a violent loss of innocence for him.
Yeah.
He suddenly understood that his intellect, his character, they were entirely secondary to his race in the eyes of the empire.
Right.
And that awareness of systemic, inescapable inequality, it only deepened when he moved to Kingston in 1905.
Because he actually did pretty well at first, right?
He did. He found work at a major printing company and actually managed to rise to become their first Afro-Jamaican foreman. So he was succeeding within the system. But then the catastrophic 1907 Kingston earthquake hit.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the city was virtually reduced to rubble. Garvey, his mother, his sister, they were left sleeping outdoors in the open for months.
That's horrifying.
And shortly after this period of immense physical vulnerability, his mother died.
Man, that is a crucible moment. He's stripped of his home, his mother, his sense of security, and it's right in this window of extreme vulnerability that he gets heavily involved in trade unionism.
Yep, he dives right in.
In 1908, he helps organize and lead a print workers' strike. And this strike ends up being this brutal crash course in labor politics. Management just crushes the strike. Garvey is sacked from his foreman position, and he is officially blacklisted.
And we should clarify for the listeners.
Yeah, please.
Being blacklisted in a small island economy isn't like losing a job in New York where you can just go to the next borough.
Right, you can't just cross town.
Exactly. It meant he was systematically locked out of his entire profession in the private sector. The establishment just closed ranks against him.
So what does he do? Because that experience had to fundamentally alter his trajectory.
It did. The anger at those societal inequalities, which had been, simmering since childhood, it finally boiled over into outright activism. Realizing he had no future in Jamaica, he joined the massive wave of Caribbean migrant labor. So in 1910, he travels to Costa Rica.
Okay.
And he takes a job as a timekeeper on a massive banana plantation run by the United Fruit Company.
The United Fruit Company.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, for anyone familiar with the history of Central America, that name is just synonymous with corporate imperialism.
They effectively ran entire countries.
Exactly. And Garvey is sitting there as a timekeeper, overseeing these grueling manual laborers, mostly fellow Afro-Caribbeans, and he just gets furious at how they are being treated. He doesn't just, keep his head down and collect a paycheck.
Not his style.
Not at all. He launches a newspaper specifically to criticize the company's labor practices. He's just relentlessly agitating. The source notes he even gets questioned by the local police for publicly questioning the motives of the local fire brigade.
Right.
I mean, he was completely incapable of observing injustice without pulling out a megaphone.
Well, he was discovering his voice. But he also realized his voice lacked the structural authority and the historical context to effect real change. So he traveled through Central America, witnessed the exact same racial and economic exploitation everywhere, suffered a severe bout of illness, and came to a pretty profound conclusion.
Which was?
He needed to advance his education. He needed to understand the actual machinery of the empire that was oppressing his people. So in 1912, he traveled to the absolute epicenter of global colonial power. He went to London.
I look at his time in London less like a traditional study abroad program and more like he was studying the blueprints of the Death Star.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. He is sitting in the heart of the British Empire, trying to reverse engineer how this tiny, damp island managed to subjugate half the globe. He is taking evening law classes at Birkbeck College to understand their legal frameworks. He's standing on soapboxes at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, learning how to command a hostile crowd. He's spending hours in the reading room at the British Museum.
And crucially, he begins working for the African Times and Orient Review. That was a publication run by Dusay Muhammad Ali, and Ali was a massive influence on him.
How so?
Well, Ali was a champion of Ethiopianism and home rule for Egypt. For context, Ethiopianism was this powerful religious and political movement that predated Garvey. It linked Black heritage back to the biblical promised land of Ethiopia. It offered this divine, glorious counter-narrative to the degradation of white supremacy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so working under Ali gave Garvey a truly global perspective on anti-colonial struggles.
And it's also in London that he reads Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up from Slavery. And Washington was preaching self-reliance and economic independence for Black Americans. So Garvey is absorbing all these raw materials, right? The legal theory, the global networking, the economic philosophy.
Taking it all in?
Yeah. And the final piece of this intellectual puzzle falls into place in 1914, literally on the ship sailing back to Jamaica. He has this long conversation with an Afro-Caribbean missionary who had been living and working in Basutoland in southern Africa. And hearing firsthand about the brutal day-to-day realities of colonial Africa just ignited something permanent in Garvey.
That conversation was the absolute catalyst for his ultimate grand vision. He realized that the struggles in Jamaica, in Costa Rica, in the American South, and in colonial Africa, they weren't isolated incidents.
They were all connected.
Exactly. They were symptoms of a global system of racial subjugation. So he envisioned a movement that would politically, socially, and economically unify Black people of African descent across the entire globe.
It's just a massive leap in ambition. So he gets off that boat in Jamaica in 1914, completely fired up, and he immediately founds the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, and he coins this incredibly powerful, unforgettable motto: one aim, one God, one destiny.
That's brilliant branding.
It is. He is ready to launch a global revolution right from Kingston, but it completely fizzles out.
Total failure.
Total failure. The launch is a disaster. The brown middle class of Jamaica totally rejects him. They dismiss him as this pretentious, dark-skinned social climber. And Garvey, instead of building bridges, alienates the poorer, working-class Jamaicans. He writes these blistering letters to the local newspaper calling them uncouth and vulgar.
Yeah, his approach during this Jamaican launch was heavily, fundamentally flawed. He suffered from a severe miscalculation of his audience.
What was he thinking?
Well, he actually appealed directly to the white colonial elite, including the British governor of Jamaica. He asked them for funding to uplift the Black masses. He positioned himself as part of the cultured class, claiming he wanted to elevate the peasantry to what he termed civilized approval.
Oh, man. You can see why that wouldn't play well.
Naturally, the working-class Jamaicans had zero interest in a leader who condescended to them and sought the approval of their oppressors. And the middle class actively resented his immense ambition.
I'm looking at this absolute tactical disaster, and I have to ask you, how does this total failure to launch the UNIA in his home country translate into his massive global success just a few years later? Because on paper, this looks like the end of the road. His own people rejected him.
Consider failure as the ultimate refining fire for a visionary, right? The disaster in Jamaica forced Garvey into two critical realizations. First, his message of radical Black unity was just incompatible with the deeply entrenched, finely graded class structures of his homeland. The colorist hierarchy there was too rigid, it was too internalized by the population.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, he realized he needed a totally different demographic. He needed an audience that was displaced, untethered from their traditional social structures, actively seeking a new sense of identity, and ready for a militant message of self-reliance. He needed a powder keg.
Right.
And he found that perfect storm in the United States.
Yeah, Garvey's failure in Jamaica proved one crucial thing. He was a man selling an earthquake in a town that didn't want to shake. He needed a population that was already uprooted. And in 1916, there was no place on earth with more uprooted, searching people than Harlem.
Absolutely.
He arrives in New York City, and the timing is almost cinematic. World War I is shaking up the entire global order, completely destabilizing the idea of European supremacy. And domestically, the Great Migration is in full swing.
Millions of people moving.
Millions. African Americans are fleeing the racial terror and sharecropping poverty of the rural South, flooding into northern industrial cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit. The audience is perfectly primed. But as with Jamaica, his start in America was incredibly rocky.
Oh, rocky might be an understatement. During his very first public speech in New York, the crowd, who were accustomed to highly polished, established local leaders, they heckled him so mercilessly that he became disoriented, lost his footing, and literally fell off the stage.
Wait, he physically fell off the stage?
Literally fell right off. It was a humiliating debut. But, Garvey possessed an undeniable, relentless internal drive. He did not retreat.
Yeah, he didn't pack it up.
No. Instead, he recognized he needed to understand the specific vernacular of the American Black experience. So he embarked on this exhausting, self-funded speaking tour across 38 U.S. states.
38 states. He is just grinding it out. And what I find brilliant is how he spent that time. He wasn't just talking, he was listening. He intensely studied the preachers in the Black Baptist and African Methodist Episcopal churches. He was absorbing the rhythm, the cadence, the whole call and response dynamic of American Black spirituality.
Right. He was learning how to move a crowd emotionally, not just intellectually.
Exactly. And when he returns to New York in 1917, having mastered that rhetorical style, he officially launches the New York branch of the UNIA. And the growth from that point forward is historically unprecedented.
It really is. By 1919, just 2 years later, he was claiming 2 million members. Now, historians debate the exact figures because Garvey was definitely prone to immense exaggeration.
Sure.
But even the most conservative estimates place the membership in the hundreds of thousands. That makes it the largest Black mass movement in history up to that point.
I want to pause on that for a second because the logistics are just mind-boggling. How does a broke immigrant Jamaican who literally fell off a stage 3 years prior build a network of millions before the invention of the internet, before television?
He achieved it through brilliant, highly decentralized grassroots organizing. He structured the UNIA not just as a political advocacy group, but as a mutual aid society.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, local UNIA branches operated almost like fraternal lodges. They offered death benefits, sickness funds, and a really vibrant social calendar. So if you were a recent migrant from Georgia arriving in Harlem, lonely and overwhelmed, the UNIA gave you an immediate community, a safety net, and a profound sense of belonging.
That is so smart.
Furthermore, he weaponized print media like no one before him.
The Negro World newspaper. This was his masterstroke. He didn't rely on white-owned distribution networks, he built his own. The Negro World was published weekly in multiple languages, English, Spanish, and French, to reach the entire diaspora.
Yes.
The sources say it was read aloud in barbershops in Harlem, passed around in churches in Chicago, and it was literally smuggled into colonial Africa by Black sailors.
And colonial authorities across Africa and the Caribbean banned the newspaper because it was so radically subversive, which, of course, only made people want to read it more.
Oh, 100%. Nothing sells papers like banning them. And through the Negro World, he deliberately and aggressively contrasted his movement with the existing civil rights organizations of the era, primarily the NAACP.
Right, and this is a fundamental ideological split we have to explore. The NAACP, led by towering intellectual figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, was an integrated multiracial organization. They focused primarily on legal challenges to segregation and achieving full racial integration into American society.
Yeah.
Du Bois championed what he called the talented 10th. The idea that a highly educated elite of Black doctors, lawyers, and academics would lead the broader race to equality.
And Garvey looked at that talented 10th concept and completely rejected it. He viewed it as elitist and utterly disconnected from the reality of the working masses. Garvey declared the UNIA would be a Black-only organization.
Yes, very strictly.
He deliberately appealed to the everyday laborers, the domestic workers, the factory hands, and the massive influx of Caribbean migrants who felt ignored by the American-born Black elite. He preached this immense, uncompromising racial pride. There's a famous quote of his that perfectly encapsulates this. He urged Black people to take the kinks out of your mind instead of out of your hair.
That was a revolutionary, deeply psychological stance. Garvey recognized that hundreds of years of slavery and colonialism had inflicted profound psychological scars.
Absolutely.
Society constantly reinforced the idea that Blackness was synonymous with ugliness and inferiority. He tackled that head-on. As a matter of strict policy, he refused to print any advertisements for skin lightening creams or hair straightening chemicals in the Negro world,
Wow.
even though those ads were the primary source of revenue for almost every other black publication at the time.
Talk about putting your money where your mouth is.
Mm.
He was telling his followers, you are beautiful as you are, you descend from kings and queens, do not emulate the people oppressing you.
Exactly.
But he didn't just stop at psychological liberation. He knew you needed economic power to back it up. So under the umbrella of the UNIA, he launched the Negro Factories Corporation. He wanted black people to trade exclusively with one another, completely independent of white capital.
Right.
He opened grocery stores, a restaurant, a steam laundry, a publishing house, even a millinery store making hats.
He was attempting to build a truly parallel economy.
Mm-hmm.
And the absolute zenith of this economic vision, the project that captured the imagination of the world, was the Black Star Line.
Yes, the Black Star Line.
This was a black-owned, black-operated shipping company, and the name itself was a stroke of genius. It was a direct, defiant nod to the white-owned White Star Line, the company famous for building the Titanic.
Oh, that's such a great detail.
Garvey's grand vision was a massive fleet of ships traveling between Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas, facilitating independent global trade and eventually transporting migrants back to the African continent.
The way he funded the Black Star Line is what really strikes me as modern. He basically invented a 1919 version of GoFundMe or Kickstarter.
He really did.
He sold shares in the company for $5 each, explicitly targeting the working class. And the brilliance of it was that everyday people weren't just buying a stock certificate hoping for a quarterly financial dividend. They were buying a piece of a dream. They were investing in a shared identity, a tangible symbol of their own independence.
That is precisely why it was so successful initially. He understood that for marginalized, disenfranchised people, holding a beautifully printed stock certificate for a shipping line owned by their own people provided a sense of dignity that the rest of society systematically denied them.
Yeah.
Garvey was an unparalleled marketer. He knew that an oppressed people needed pageantry. They needed visible symbols of power to counteract the degradation they faced daily.
Which brings us right back to August 1920 and that incredible scene at Madison Square Garden we talked about at the top of the show.
Right.
The first international conference of the Negro peoples. 25,000 delegates from all over the world packed into the arena. The pomp and spectacle were completely off the charts. You had the African Legion marching down the aisles in full military dress with swords drawn.
Amazing visual.
You had the Black Cross nurses in crisp white uniforms. And this is the moment where the delegates officially elect Marcus Garvey as the Provisional President of Africa. He starts handing out aristocratic titles like the Order of the Nile and the Order of Ethiopia. He has literally created an entire nation-state of the mind.
It was a masterstroke of political theater. He gave his followers a nation before they even had land. However, this is also where we must confront the tragic flaw in his leadership.
Here we go.
The pageantry was flawless, but the actual physical operations of his economic empire were a total disaster.
Right. I have to push back a little on the whole visionary entrepreneur label here. We see this incredible marketing genius, but when you look at the nuts and bolts of the Black Star Line, it's horrifying.
Oh, it's really bad.
The first ship they bought, the SS Yarmouth, was a 30-year-old rust bucket, right? It was a tramp ship that had been used to haul coal. It constantly broke down, and they paid an exorbitant, highly inflated price for it. I look at this and I see a CEO who is completely intoxicated by his own press releases, totally blind to his operational incompetence. How do you reconcile the genius marketer with the guy buying sinking ships?
You reconcile it by understanding that his immense ambition actively blinded him to his logistical limitations. Garvey possessed a naive, almost delusional iron-willed determination. He truly believed that the righteousness of his cause would somehow overcome structural reality.
Just will it into existence.
Exactly. Because he lacked any maritime or large-scale business experience, he was easily swindled by shipbrokers. Furthermore, his authoritarian leadership style meant he surrounded himself with sycophants who told him what he wanted to hear, rather than competent operational managers who would tell him the hard truths.
And the irony is just painful, because they initially couldn't find enough trained black seamen with the right certifications. The Yarmouth had to be staffed by a white chief engineer and a white chief officer.
Yeah.
The ship was in terrible condition, supposedly running aground multiple times. They bought a second ship, the Shady Side, which was meant to be an excursion boat on the Hudson River, and it literally ended up abandoned and rotting on the mud flats in New Jersey.
Just a total loss.
His complete lack of operational oversight doomed the very people, those everyday laborers who gave him their $5 investments that he genuinely wanted to uplift. He promised them a utopian economic fleet, but delivered a logistical nightmare that burned their life savings.
It is the tragedy of a leader whose rhetoric vastly outpaced his administrative capacity.
Huh.
But, it wasn't just his chaotic business practices that began to fracture his empire.
Right, there's more.
As the UNIA grew into this massive, highly visible global force, it naturally drew the attention of powerful enemies. And the most damaging controversies arose not from his financial blunders, but from the exposure of his deeply radical, highly polarizing ideological beliefs.
Let's dive deep into that ideology, because this is where the story gets incredibly dark and complex. We know his foundation was Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism. He was the most vocal proponent of the Back to Africa movement. But, and this is a massive misconception I had before reading the source material, he did not want all Black Americans to move to Africa.
No, he didn't.
He didn't envision a mass exodus of millions. He only wanted a highly educated, highly skilled, pure-blooded elite vanguard to make the journey. He wanted engineers, doctors, and builders to go establish the infrastructure of this new empire in places like Liberia.
That is a crucial nuance that is often lost in the mythology of Garvey.
Mm.
He viewed Africa as a continent to be redeemed and developed by this specific diaspora vanguard. But this immediately raises the question: what did he believe would happen to the millions of everyday Black people, the sharecroppers, the domestic workers, the factory hands who remained in the United States?
And his answer to that is chilling. He stated quite openly in print that he believed the remaining African-American population would become literally extinct within 50 years.
Extinct?
Extinct, due to racial competition, economic starvation, and violent oppression by the white majority.
It is a stunningly bleak display of racial pessimism regarding the American project, and it ties directly into his absolute rejection of integration. Garvey totally dismissed the American melting pot concept.
Completely threw it out.
Right. He fundamentally believed that white people, inherently and permanently, would never grant equality to Black people. To him, the very idea of fighting for civil rights within a white-majority nation was not just a strategic error, it was a pathetic delusion.
And this belief in permanent racial separation mutated into an absolute obsession with racial purity. He viciously, publicly opposed miscegenation mixed-race relationships.
Yes.
He argued that mixed-race individuals were inherently unstable, torn by dual allegiances, and that in any racial conflict, they would ultimately side with the more powerful white race, becoming inevitable traitors to the Black race.
Which naturally brought him into a furious, deeply personal, and highly public collision with W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP. Du Bois was of mixed heritage, as were many leaders in the NAACP. Du Bois was the leading intellectual voice advocating for legal equality, voting rights, and full social integration. He looked at Garvey's separatist rhetoric, his theatrical uniforms, and his failing business ventures, and declared Garvey to be a dangerous, bombastic demagogue who was misleading the masses.
And Garvey did not take criticism lightly. He attacked Du Bois relentlessly in the pages of the Negro World. He called him a reactionary under the pay of white men. And leaning into that obsession with racial purity, he cruelly referred to Du Bois as an unfortunate mulatto who bewails every drop of Negro blood in his veins.
Very harsh words.
The rhetoric was incredibly toxic. The Black intelligentsia of the time was so alarmed by Garvey's growing power and his divisive attacks that they actually launched a formalized Garvey Must Go campaign. They were actively petitioning the government to have him deported.
The feud fractured the civil rights landscape of the 1920s, but nothing, absolutely nothing, stoked the flames of this rivalry and damaged Garvey's reputation quite like the events of June 1922.
Oh boy.
This is arguably the most controversial moment of his entire life. Garvey traveled to Atlanta, Georgia, and intentionally arranged a sit-down meeting with Edward Young Clark. Clark was the imperial wizard pro tempore of the Ku Klux Klan.
I am still struggling to wrap my head around this. I really am. I mean, we all know the pragmatic political saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But the KKK wasn't just a political opponent of the NAACP. They were an active domestic terror organization.
Absolutely.
They were actively terrorizing, lynching, and murdering Black people across the country. I look at this and I see a leader who was so blinded by his own ideological purity, his obsession with separation, that he completely betrayed the physical safety and the trauma of his own followers. How on earth did he justify this to himself?
From a modern perspective, it is entirely indefensible, but we have to examine it through the lens of Garvey's strict, uncompromising race-first framework. To Garvey, it possessed a twisted, pragmatic logic.
A very twisted logic.
He recognized that both the UNIA and the Ku Klux Klan wanted the exact same ultimate outcome: the total, permanent geographic and social separation of the black and white races.
He actually went on record saying that he regarded the KKK and other white supremacist groups as better friends in the race than all other groups of hypocritical whites put together.
Yeah, he said he appreciated their honesty.
He preferred a white man in a hood holding a torch over a white, liberal, promising integration that he believed would never come. But how did his movement survive this? If I'm an everyday reader of the Negro world whose family fled the South to escape the Klan, and I see my provisional president shaking hands with them, I mean, that has to be a breaking point.
And for many, it absolutely was. News of the KKK meeting caused widespread outrage, massive defection, and public denunciations from his own branch leaders. It marked the definitive turning point where his popularity began to wane.
Makes total sense.
However, for the hardcore loyalists who stayed, it was rationalized through that dark pragmatism. Garvey genuinely believed that the terror inflicted by the KKK was a useful tool. He thought that if the Klan made life unbearable for black Americans, it would finally destroy the illusion of integration. It would force black people to become entirely self-reliant and accelerate his goal of building an independent black nation. He was willing to be hated by the mainstream civil rights leaders because he believed he was playing a much longer, brutal game of global racial survival.
It's a level of ideological stubbornness that borders on the pathological. He alienated the entire black intellectual class. He alienated a huge chunk of his own base. And as we shift focus to his downfall, we see that it wasn't just his ideological clashes that destroyed him.
No, it wasn't.
It was his highly disorganized business practices that handed the federal government the exact, precise ammunition they needed to take him out.
Enter J. Edgar Hoover.
Of course.
In 1919, Hoover was a young, incredibly ambitious official working for the Bureau of Investigation, which was the precursor to the FBI. Hoover had been aggressively monitoring Garvey. The context here is vital. 1919 was the Red Summer, a period of intense, bloody racial violence and riots across dozens of American cities.
Right, the government was on edge.
The U.S. government was absolutely terrified of the black working class becoming radicalized, militant, and organized. Hoover looked at the UNIA's massive membership, the military drills of the African Legion, and Garvey's anti-colonial rhetoric, and identified Garvey as a supreme, subversive threat to national security.
So what did Hoover do?
Hoover was so determined to dismantle the movement that he actually hired the Bureau's first full-time black agent, a man named James Wormley Jones, specifically to infiltrate the UNIA headquarters in Harlem.
Hoover was just waiting, watching, hoping Garvey would make a fatal mistake. And Garvey, with his utterly chaotic, delusionally optimistic management of the Black Star Line, served up that mistake on a silver platter.
He certainly did.
In 1922, the government swoops in and Garvey is arrested for mail fraud. The charge is almost absurdly specific, but legally, it's deadly. He was accused of advertising and selling stock through the U.S. Postal Service for a ship, which they called the Orion, that the Black Star Line didn't actually own yet. The government found brochures where the UNIA had literally doctored a photograph of a ship, erased its original name, painted on the name Phyllis Wheatley, and used it to solicit investments.
The trial commenced in May 1923, and it was a masterclass in self-destruction. The presiding judge was Julian Mack, a man Garvey immediately and deeply distrusted, primarily because Mack was a member of the NAACP and had contributed to their legal defense funds.
So Garvey felt the deck was stacked.
Garvey felt the trial was rigged from the start. His own defense attorney, Cornelius McDougald, looked at the evidence and strongly urged Garvey to plead guilty to secure a minimum sentence.
Take the plea deal.
Right. But Garvey, deeply insulted by the idea of admitting fault, refused. In a catastrophic move, he fired his lawyer mid-trial and decided to represent himself.
If you've ever watched a CEO of a collapsed tech company testify before Congress today and arrogantly blame everyone but themselves, you are watching the exact playbook Garvey used in 1923.
It's so true.
I compare his trial strategy to a captain going down with his sinking ship, but instead of trying to patch the holes, he spends the entire trial trying to throw his own crew overboard to save his own skin. He had no formal legal training. He paced the courtroom, and in his staggering 3-hour closing argument, he essentially presented himself as a flawless, selfless, divine leader who was entirely victimized by his incompetent, thieving, deceitful staff.
Unsurprisingly, the jury saw right through the bluster. They recognized the obvious deceit in the promotional materials. After deliberating for 10 hours, they found Garvey guilty of mail fraud, while notably acquitting his 3 co-defendants, the very staff he tried to blame.
Wow, acquitted the staff.
Yep. Garvey was absolutely incandescent with rage. And in a moment of sheer, desperate fury following the verdict, he lashed out in the courtroom, shouting abuse and blaming his conviction on what he called a damn dirty Jewish judge and jury.
We have to pause on that outburst because it's a deeply jarring detail. The source material explicitly notes that prior to this trial, Garvey had never expressed anti-Semitic sentiment.
No, he hadn't.
In fact, he had been highly supportive of Zionism, viewing it as a parallel movement to his own Pan-African goals. And years later, in 1933, he wrote powerful editorials praising the Jewish race and openly denouncing the rise of Nazi intolerance in Germany. But in that courtroom, in that moment of defeat, he unleashed severe, vile anti-Semitism.
It was a reprehensible outburst, and psychologically it was likely born from a paranoid, desperate search for a scapegoat to explain his colossal failure. He combined his intense hatred of the NAACP, which had prominent Jewish board members, with the ethnic identity of Judge Mack, resulting in that toxic slur.
And Judge Mack obviously didn't take that well.
Judge Mack did not show leniency. He sentenced Garvey to the maximum 5 years in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary and imposed a heavy fine. Many historians argue that the severity of the sentence was directly influenced by Garvey's arrogant, combative, and offensive courtroom behavior.
So the Provisional President of Africa is sent to federal prison in Atlanta in 1925. His physical health deteriorates rapidly in the harsh conditions. He develops chronic bronchitis and severe bouts of influenza. It looks like the absolute end.
But it isn't.
Right, his movement doesn't totally die, and that is entirely thanks to his second wife, Amy Jacques Garvey. She steps up in an incredible way.
She really becomes the engine.
She tirelessly keeps his voice alive, managing the organization's correspondence. She compiles and publishes his writings and speeches into a highly influential book called Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey. But she does something very strategic. She intentionally edits out his most inflammatory, militant rhetoric about violence and racial purity. She's trying to sanitize his image to appeal to a broader public and appease the government.
Her strategic editing, combined with the lingering loyalty of his base, fueled a massive public pressure campaign. A petition containing an astonishing 70,000 signatures was delivered to the U.S. Attorney General.
70,000 signatures in that era is huge.
The argument presented wasn't necessarily that Garvey was innocent of poor business practices, but that Black Americans viewed his imprisonment not as justice for financial fraud, but as a deliberate, politically motivated act of racial oppression by the U.S. government.
Yeah.
Finally, in late 1927, President Calvin Coolidge bowed to the political pressure and commuted his sentence. But it came with a strict, non-negotiable condition. Garvey was to be immediately deported back to Jamaica and banned from re-entering the United States.
Before we follow him into his exile, I have to ask you to weigh in on the core debate of this trial. Was the U.S. government genuinely acting in good faith to protect everyday citizens from financial fraud? Because let's be real, those poor working-class people who bought the Black Star Line stock did lose their money. Real harm was done.
That's true.
Or was the mail fraud charge just a highly convenient, perfectly legal excuse to dismantle a massive, radical political threat?
The historical record shows it is undoubtedly a mix of both, but the scales tip heavily toward the latter.
Okay, so more political.
Yes. The financial mismanagement was undeniable. Garvey did authorize misleading advertising, and the Black Star Line was a catastrophic operational failure that incinerated the hard-earned savings of working-class people. The government had the clear legal right and precedent to prosecute.
Right.
However, Hoover's motivations from the very beginning were explicitly and intensely political. The Bureau of Investigation wasn't spending years infiltrating the UNIA because they deeply cared about the financial well-being of Black citizens in Harlem.
No, they didn't care about that.
They were investigating him because he was successfully organizing millions of Black people into a militant, separatist, anti-colonial structure. The mail fraud charge was simply the most effective, unassailable tool Hoover found to neutralize a man he viewed as a supreme subversive threat.
That context is vital. They got him on a technicality to solve a political problem. So we arrive at the final act of his life. It's 1927. Garvey is stripped of his massive American empire, placed on a boat, and exiled back to his homeland of Jamaica.
Back where he started.
At first, there is a glimmer of hope. He is treated like a returning hero by the massive crowds at the docks. He tries to rebuild. He forms the People's Political Party, running for local office with a platform that was surprisingly ahead of its time. He advocated for a minimum wage, extensive land reform, and the creation of a Jamaican university.
But the colonial establishment in Jamaica had not changed, and they were just as hostile to him as ever. During his campaign, he published a manifesto criticizing the corruption of the local judiciary.
Which is a big mistake.
Huge mistake.
Yeah.
The establishment immediately pounced on this, charged him with seditious libel, essentially criminalizing his political speech against the government, and threw him in a Spanish town jail for 3 months.
Wow.
His political momentum was shattered. Furthermore, his financial situation deteriorated completely amidst the onset of the global Great Depression. He was forced to work as a local auctioneer just to feed his family. By 1934, his massive, vibrant Kingston headquarters, Edelweiss Park, was foreclosed upon by creditors and auctioned off. He was functionally broke and politically marginalized.
Feeling completely defeated and constrained in Jamaica, he makes one last move. He relocates to London in 1935. And this final chapter of his life is just profoundly tragic.
It really is.
He's isolated in a damp, gray city. The world around him has moved on. A new, vibrant generation of Black radical thinkers, Marxists, and highly educated Pan-Africanists like C.L.R. James and George Padmore are now dominating the intellectual scene in London.
Right.
Garvey, who remained fiercely anti-communist, anti-socialist, and rigid in his 1920s ideology, clashes bitterly with all of them. He goes back to Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, the place where he first honed his voice, but now he gets harangued and out-debated by these younger radicals.
He was a man out of time.
Yeah.
In his isolation, he made a severe, alienating political miscalculation regarding international affairs.
North Park is wild.
When fascist Italy, under Mussolini, violently invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the entire Black diaspora rallied around the Ethiopian emperor, Haile Selassie. Selassie became the ultimate symbol of ancient African resistance against modern European colonialism.
Right.
But when Selassie was forced to flee the invasion and sought exile in Britain, Garvey stunned the world by publicly viciously denouncing him. Garvey wrote editorials calling Selassie a feudal monarch and a great coward who ran away from his country to save his skin.
Which was the absolute final nail in the coffin for his public support. By attacking the most revered symbol of African resistance in the world, he alienated almost every single one of his remaining followers. Even his closest allies were disgusted.
Exactly.
Due to the damp climate aggravating his son's severe asthma, his wife Amy and their children are forced to leave London and return to Jamaica. Garvey is furious at her departure and is left completely, utterly alone in a London apartment. Then, in 1940, the strangest, most bizarre thing happens.
Yeah, this is so strange.
His old intellectual rival, George Padmore, maliciously spreads rumors that Garvey has died. The major newswires pick it up, and newspapers around the world actually publish premature obituaries.
Try to imagine the profound psychological toll of that experience. Garvey is sitting alone in London, largely paralyzed and weakened from a recent stroke, having his secretary read his own obituaries from the daily papers.
Reading his own obituary.
Yeah. And these weren't glowing tributes, they were dismissive accounts, summarizing his life as a failure, a fraud, a washed-up demagogue. According to his secretary, on the second day of reading these brutal assessments of his life's work, the stress caused him to suffer a second massive stroke.
Wow.
2 weeks later, on June 10, 1940, at the age of just 52, Marcus Garvey died. Because of the raging battles of World War II, his body could not be returned home. He was temporarily interred in a lead-lined vault in a Catholic cemetery in West London. He died far away from Jamaica, far away from the empire he built in Harlem, and incredibly far away from the continent of Africa.
It's an unbelievably lonely, bitter end to such a massive life. But this is where the story takes a massive, astonishing turn into the mythological, because the physical man died in London, but the idea he planted exploded across the globe.
It really did.
How does a man who died broke, ostracized, and isolated end up becoming a literal religious prophet?
Oh.
Because back in Jamaica, the Rastafari movement emerges in the 1930s and 40s, and they view Marcus Garvey not as a failed businessman, but as a divine prophet.
Yeah, they do.
They view him as a modern John the Baptist figure who literally foretold the divine crowning of Haile Selassie, the very man Garvey criticized in real life.
It is the ultimate historical irony.
Yeah.
But it speaks volumes about the power of a symbol, superseding the messy reality of the man. Movements almost always outgrow their founders. Over time, history tends to sanitize its most radical, flawed figures.
Yeah.
The The Rastafari movement, the anti-colonial fighters in Africa, and later the Black Power movement of the 1960s in America didn't need the flawed, authoritarian, deeply prejudiced, poor business manager that Marcus Garvey was in reality. They needed the symbol of Marcus Garvey.
They needed the guy who told them to take the kinks out of their minds. They needed the guy who told a displaced, traumatized people that they descended from royalty and were destined for greatness.
Yes, and that emotional resonance is his true legacy. People remembered how Garvey made them feel. He gave millions of people a sense of profound pride, dignity, and a vision of global consequence at a time when the entire architecture of global society was explicitly designed to tell them they were worthless.
That's a huge shift.
His influence is everywhere. Kwame Nkrumah, who led the Gold Coast to independence to become the first president of a free Ghana, cited Marcus Garvey as his biggest single inspiration. Nkrumah even put a black star squarely in the center of the Ghanaian national flag in his honor.
That's amazing.
And Martin Luther King Jr., whose integrationist philosophy was entirely opposite to Garvey's, still visited Garvey's shrine in Jamaica in 1965, explicitly crediting him as the first man to give millions of Negroes a sense of dignity and destiny on a mass scale.
The rehabilitation of his images is just total. His body was finally exhumed from London in 1964, brought back to Jamaica, and he was reburied with massive state honors as the country's very first national hero. And the arc of history just keeps bending. On January 19, 2025, U.S. President Joe Biden issued a full and unconditional posthumous pardon to Marcus Garvey,
Yes.
officially acknowledging that the original 1923 mail fraud charges were politically fabricated by J. Edgar Hoover to silence a rising civil rights leader. The complete reversal from federal inmate to pardoned historical icon is wild.
It forces us to hold two contradictory truths in our minds simultaneously. We must separate the profound, undeniable, world-shifting impact of his core message from the deeply problematic, often destructive ways he operated as a human being.
Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway of this deep dive. Marcus Garvey was deeply, tragically flawed. He was an atrocious operational businessman who lost the savings of his poorest followers. He was highly polarizing and arrogant.
Yeah, that can't be ignored.
His views on absolute racial purity and his willing alliance with the Ku Klux Klan are frankly indefensible and horrific. Yet, his impact on instilling a sense of collective pride, demanding self-reliance, and forging a global identity for the African diaspora is the undeniable bedrock of modern civil rights and Pan-African movements. You simply cannot tell the story of the 20th century without reckoning with Marcus Garvey.
He was the imperfect architect of a global awakening. He proved that you could mobilize millions of the most marginalized people on Earth, not just with dry policy proposals or legal briefs, but with brilliant pageantry, uncompromising pride, and the audacious promise of a shared, glorious destiny.
So for you listening, I want you to connect this history to the present. Think about the modern movements or visionary leaders that you follow today. Look at the disruptive tech CEOs promising utopian futures, the political populists rallying massive crowds, the online gurus selling a new way of life. How much of their success relies purely on the feeling, the aesthetic, and the identity they give their followers, rather than the practical day-to-day execution of their actual ideas? Are we, in our own modern ways, still buying $5 tickets for the Black Star Line?
It's an incredibly critical lens through which to view any modern leadership that relies on charisma over competence.
And I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to mull over. We started this deep dive by talking about how Marcus Garvey crowned himself the Provisional President of Africa without ever setting foot on the continent. But imagine just for a second if his chaotic plans had succeeded.
What if he pulled it off?
Exactly. If he had actually managed to move his educated elite vanguard across the ocean to Liberia, would he have built the utopian, self-reliant African empire he so beautifully dreamed of? Or given his openly stated admiration for absolute authority, his love of regal pomp and military uniforms, and his dark obsession with racial purity, would he have simply become the very type of oppressive, authoritarian dictator he claimed to be fighting against? Think about that. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.